Hello all. Welcome to the first installment of our four-part series on public humanities in higher education. Thanks very much to everyone for joining us. I'll give us maybe 30 more seconds to see people coming in. I'm Michelle May Curry, Project Director for Humanities for All, which, with the generous support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, advocates for and supports publicly engaged humanities scholarship based at higher ed institutions. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by three higher ed faculty who each lead public humanities projects. Jason Ruiz, who is an Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame, 2019-2020 Whiting Fellow and Project Director for Latinx Murals of Pilsen, a digital toolkit for scholarship, teaching, and discovery. Araceli Hernández-Laroche, who is Associate Professor of Modern Languages and Director of the South Carolina Centro Latino at the University of South Carolina Upstate. And Hana Maruyama, who is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Connecticut and co-creator and producer of Kampu, a podcast created in partnership with the Japanese American oral history organization Densho. Note that you can view recordings of this and future events in the series on our YouTube channel, which you can access through the event page linked just shared in the chat. Today, the focus of our conversation will be on starting points for building a publicly engaged humanities practice. Across college and university campuses, humanities scholars are responding to an increasingly loud call from students, administrators, faculty, local community members, and scholarly societies to employ the tools of their discipline to engage with public audiences outside of the academy. But how do you get started? What skill sets need to be learned? And how do you navigate a complex network of funding and support structures that vary widely based on institution type, discipline, and region? After hearing brief intros to each of the panelist projects, we will spend some time in conversation about these topics and hope to generate some fruitful starting points for those in the audience who might hope to begin, or perhaps help others begin, a public humanities project of their own. Before we hear from our presenters, I'd like to take a moment to frame today's conversation in light of the work of Humanities for All as a website and a database, which since 2018 has served as a digital home base for public humanities scholars based in higher ed. With over 2,000 projects archived on Humanities for All, scholars and practitioners looking for points of inspiration can browse projects by state, institution type of community partner, discipline, and theme. So regardless of your discipline and area of expertise, you can find projects that can serve as models for your publicly engaged work. For those looking to understand the key goals and methods of public humanities, including the role of mutually beneficial community partnership, our website also includes essays that can be assigned to students or used as framing for grant applications. Humanities for All is especially helpful for those looking for starting points and who are interested in community engaged work, but perhaps are looking to grow their knowledge base themselves or convince others, whether administrators, collaborators, or peers, of the value and growing imprint of this work in higher ed and in communities. We're excited to have three leaders with us today who are doing this important work at a high level. A quick note on format for today's webinar: we plan to have plenty of time for discussion and questions from the audience following our conversation. Please submit questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll be sharing links through the chat, but please be sure to submit your questions via Q&A rather than the chat so they don't get lost. We'll try to field as many of our broader questions for the entire panel as possible. And with that, let's begin. So hello, everyone. So good to see you. If we could start by having each of you describe your projects for the audience, including its scope and mission and any significant outcomes to date, that would be excellent. Jason, how about we start with you?
Sounds good, Michelle. And I want to say thank you for convening this group. It's so exciting to be talking with such a robust audience. We can see that there's more than 130 people here. So this is probably the biggest crowd I've ever been able to talk to about my own Pilsen project. And I really want to say thanks for all the work that you do with the Humanities Alliance and Humanities for All. I mean, this is such great resources. And I love that you're starting with starting points, because I'm sure I speak for Araceli and Hannah that getting started is by far the hardest part of all of this. So I think if you're helping people get started, you're really, you're giving them a little boost in terms of getting started. And that's really part of my goal in being here today. So thanks so much. I want to start by introducing you just to our project. You asked for an overview. I will just show you some stuff while I talk a little bit about our project, which is called Latinx Murals of Pilsen. So I'm showing you a very rudimentary website. As I told Michelle in the practice session, I'm a little nervous because none of this has been seen by the public yet. So please be gentle. Don't be gentle in the Q&A. Don't censor yourself in the Q&A, but please understand this is kind of a prototype. Latinx Murals of Pilsen is a public-facing research project aimed at providing digital tools for anyone interested in public art in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago. As I'm sure some of the attendees will know, Pilsen is kind of the historic heart of Latino Chicago and is the home of hundreds, maybe even over 1,000 murals that date from the early 1970s to the present. It's a really dynamic neighborhood. I'll show you a quick map. These are some tours that we are working on. We're kind of starting with some themed tours. Our ultimate goal is for users to be able to design their own tours, but here are some suggested tours. Here you'll see, for example, the Heart of Pilsen tour will take you to some of kind of what I consider the greatest hits of the Pilsen neighborhood. Some of the most influential works of art that have been adorning the city walls for a while. We also have, I'll show you our little map feature that'll show you how you can also take a self-guided tour through Pilsen through this. Our goal is simple. It is to put information in front of people. So when you talk about starting points, one of the things that's really important for me to acknowledge here is that this is really different than a lot of my academic work. And I wonder if Araceli and Hannah can relate. We are designed as scholars to be always critical and analytical and think big, 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 big. And really this project starts with just putting information in front of people. And part of my motivation for that was partly because I started teaching on courses on the Latino Midwest, on Latino Chicago, and it was pretty obvious to me that there were very few resources out there for how to engage my own students with public art. There was very little information about what I consider a really important neighborhood, obviously for the Latino Midwest, but then a really important kind of arts district that does not have sort of does not have the label that other arts districts in the US, the labels. I don't know if I should be advocating for labels here, but I hope you see where I'm going with this. There was very little information about how to engage with public art for people. Here, as you could see, the Chicago Public Art Group, who we met with a couple of years ago, actually was extremely generous to let us open up basically a suitcase full of old slides and let us digitize almost 500 archival images. So ultimately, you asked about goals. Our goal with the project is to document as much as we can about this neighborhood, this amazing, incredible neighborhood that is in a real moment of transition right now. If you've been to Pilsen, you have undoubtedly seen the signs of gentrification, which are right now dramatically impacting the demographics of Pilsen, which is no longer the most Latino neighborhood in Chicago. In fact, there are now suburbs that are more demographically Latino than Pilsen. This has everything to do with gentrification and the fact that I've now conducted dozens of interviews with artists. Those will all be on our website with bilingual transcription. And one of the sort of most haunting findings that we're coming out with this is just how difficult it is to be a working artist in Pilsen right now, partly because of gentrification. I could talk about that for 5 hours and you gave me 5 minutes. So let me just close by saying some of the things that we are building in the website, as you saw, I hope, a glimpse of. free walking tours, interviews with artists in both English and Spanish, bilingual transcripts of those interviews, archival images, as I just showed you. I'm now working with the School of Architecture at the University of Notre Dame to do some digitizing of stuff to make 3D models of certain artists' homes and buildings and studios. We're doing 3D kind of photography, so you can go actually enter an artist studio. So our audience, as you asked about, is anyone ages 3 to 303 who might be interested in public art. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about this later, but for me, part of the challenge is that I'm no longer writing for an academic audience or empowering my team to write for an academic audience. We are really writing for a general audience here and trying to engage the public. I've been trying to keep in mind the Chicago school kid who wants to write one of their first ever essays about muralism in Pilsen. I want to be able to give them some information about these artists and their works, but I also want PhD level dissertation writers to be able to access this really important, I would argue, really important data. I've been personally building out this content, but I've also been working with classes that I teach at Notre Dame to do this, along with community volunteers and partners and the artists themselves to build out this content. So this is a little glimpse of where we are now with the project and kind of a broad overview. And I really look forward to hearing from my co-panelists about their own work.
Thank you so much, Jason. Araceli.
Yes, thank you so much. Let me see if do you see the screen? Is it okay? Yes. Well, hello everyone. Hola, bonjour. Michelle, thank you so much for this opportunity. Jason, Hannah, you're such a stellar panel. I'm so honored and I'm so happy to see colleagues here and also colleagues at my neighboring institution, Wofford College, here in attendance, and all of you. Thank you for making time. So very briefly, I know I only have 5 minutes, but I am the founding director of South Carolina Centro Latino. And if you notice, I code switched in the sentence, in the title. And here you see screenshots from our webpage that you can go and visit. But I do want to warn you that if you go to the Latinx tab or Avanzando or Public Humanities tab, that's going to be fully updated after finals. We are in the middle of that. But we have been in existence for about 8 months. But really, we have existed since 2016 because we have been involved in numerous public-facing events. So our mission is to establish our University of South Carolina Upstate as the university of choice for Latino students and their families and their communities. And how do we do this? Through 3 pillars: Latinx interdisciplinary studies, the multilingual public humanities, and third, translation and community interpreting. And that last pillar, it may be the most exciting for a lot of people. My dear colleague, Maria Francisco Monteso, is the expert in that because, we have so few PhD programs in the United States on translation and interpreting. But based on her involvement with the social impact network that was established by our Wofford colleagues in the Spanish department and in other departments, she realized that were really missing that public sector interpreting. So that has been so fascinating. And in order for us to do authentic community outreach, DEI work, we cannot forget about language. We cannot, do outreach only in English. We have to do it in Spanish and in other languages. And the public humanities is really our mode of doing things. All of us, I'm sure, are already engaged in that. But here are just some of our core values. But really, what I wanted to show you here is that these are images from 2016, from 2018. I'm the first tenured Mexican-American professor at this institution. To pay it forward, I thought my first keynote is going to be a graduate student. If we want to diversify the professorate, we really need to use our platforms. We have resources to bring young scholars to campus, and now he's a thriving professor in California, Tim Monreal, and he's an expert on South Carolina teachers, and we still collaborate with him. But I also want to thank Humanities for All, because they are so helpful in really mapping what we do, what a lot of us do, informing contemporary debates, amplifying community voices, helping individuals navigate difficult experiences, expanding educational access. And I'll show you an example in just a moment of just having some of our programming in Spanish, because if we want to be relevant to neighboring communities, we need to bring their voices to campus so that they can teach us. There's lots of knowledge, sabiduría, but also our programming has to be in Spanish and hopefully in other languages as we expand. I also want to give a shout out to the MLA. Thanks to my involvement with ADFL and the MLA ad hoc community for valuing the public humanities, I was able to have a language to describe the community work I have been doing for years. And if I could just share with you one outcome of South Carolina Centro Latino, is that in October, we made history in the state. We organized the first ever Latinx Higher Ed Summit. It was fantastic. The Latino media covered us, also English media. And here we are with our chancellor, who has been so incredibly supportive and now is thinking of establishing a pipeline for high school students. But a lot of the people who helped us, again, were our friends at Wofford College, were our friends at the South Carolina Commission for Minority Affairs, community activists who we've been working with for years. So maybe this is my last slide. And again, this is just a little shout out to the MLA, Dennis Looney, Lydia Tang, so many of my committee members. Shortly, we are going to present, maybe at the MLA convention, a document on valuing the public humanities. So that is coming to you. And maybe just this one slide, this is just an example of how we partner throughout the university to offer programming or resources, dialogues, platforms for dialogue in English and Spanish with the neighboring community. And here it was related to COVID. The local English media covered us, did a story on this type of outreach. So I think that there's a lot of need for this multilingual community outreach. Thank you, Michelle, and I'm sorry if I went over.
No, you're great. Thank you, Araceli. Hannah.
Hi, everyone. Michelle, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Humanities for All. And thank you to my co-panelists. I feel so lucky to have followed you, because honestly, those were incredible presentations and just so thought-provoking. One of the things that I really love about the public humanities is the opportunity to experiment with different forms. And I feel like what's so cool about this panel is that we are all doing our own thing with form. I think, you know, with Jason's work, you see the idea of a website, but you also see the geographic and mapping and the digital ability to map something that is also very physical and very like site specific as well. And with Araceli's work, you see the importance of language, the importance of community building and stuff like that. So I come from a museum background, and I was actually working in museums for about three and a half years after graduating from undergrad and before going back to graduate school. And so I was originally an English major, and I've always been fascinated by the ideas of stories. But I think that what I really love about stories is that you can tell them in so many different ways. And what was so cool about museums was that you could actually really tell a story through an object or through art or through language or through a mural, right? And that place is also about story. So one of the things that I just kind of enjoy thinking about in my work, but also in my free time, is how to tell stories and the different forms that those stories can take, and how to tell a story that really reaches the audience. And I think that that's something that public humanities is very centered on, that we need to be thinking about not just making stuff available to the audience, but making it accessible and useful for the audience. And so that's what I love about Jason and Araceli's projects. And I think that we can do that through digital media. We can do that by bringing people into our communities. We can do that by making language resources accessible. And when Araceli was talking about language, I was just like, yes, we need to make resources available in the different languages that we're talking about. But we also need to be thinking about how we're using English too, right? It's not, we can't just use our academic jargon and expect that to resonate with public audiences. And that's not their fault. That's on us, right? We need to be doing that in a way that actually reaches them. So the project that I'm going to talk to you about is Kampu, which is a podcast that I started with my little brother, who is an audio engineer, last year, right at the beginning stages of the pandemic. And it's a podcast about Japanese American incarceration during World War II. And it was 6 episodes, and it was created in partnership with a Japanese American oral history organization called Densho. And I love Densho. If you've ever been to their website, they have over 1,000 oral histories available. They have digital collections. They do a ton of social justice work. So I highly recommend checking them out. But one thing that I've always been fascinated by with oral histories is that they're both extremely compelling. They're a person's story, right? They're so powerful. And yet also listening to someone talk about themselves for 2.5 hours can be very hard to actually engage with, like for an extended period of time. And so one of the things that I wanted to think about was how to make those stories more accessible to people and make them really resonate and bring out those powerful parts of those stories. And so what we ended up doing was taking an object-centered approach, coming from my museum background, I'm sure, and thinking about how those objects would have told the stories. And then we used so many different oral histories to do that. So we used anywhere between 25 oral histories and 80 oral histories in any of our episodes. And often it was just like very short clips, but you got a sense for how these experiences really resonated between different people. So, you know, one of the things that we have over and over again is people talking about the latrines and how horrifying they were and how uncomfortable they felt in those latrines. But then you also get a sense for how different some people's experiences were. I mean, these were 120,000 people. Of course, they were spread across different sites. There were 10 main sites, and then there were a bunch of smaller ones. So you can't expect those experiences to be exactly the same across everywhere. And I think sometimes in a lot of different areas, we think that we have to try and condense the stories and make them smaller and make them fit into a coherent narrative. And I think that actually what's really powerful is thinking about how those narratives can break apart those like ideas of there's just one experience that we need to talk about, right? There are 120,000 different stories of the incarceration, and I think every single one of them is important. And so, yeah, so what we were trying to do is take a 40-minute episode and just make it tell you about the history and tell you about it in the incarceree's own voices. So in some ways, what we wanted people to come away with is that it's possible for you to learn about something from the people who experienced it, that they should be able to narrate and co-narrate that story for themselves, and that they are so, that story belongs to them, and that we can use the things that they talk about to bring out that. And we don't need to do this in a way that centers government narratives, which I think often happens with Japanese American incarceration. What we want to be doing is talking about how government impacted people and about their experiences. So yeah, I hope you'll listen to Kampu. It's total audio, so I don't have any like presentation for you, but yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you to all three of you for those great overviews. I feel like we could talk for each of you could present for an hour on each of your projects. So each of you have taken on publicly engaged projects that have evolved out of your ongoing research as scholars based in higher ed contexts. What were useful starting points for you in building out a publicly engaged practice or element to your research interests? I'm thinking here of anything from support structures or resources to new methodologies or skill sets that you've had to develop as a result of that work. Araceli, how about we start with you?
Yes, and Michelle, please make a sign if I talk too much, because I do kind of get a little carried away. Just to share with the audience, I'm an associate professor of modern languages. At this institution, I teach French. In another institution, I used to teach Spanish and French. So my research is on public intellectuals, French, North African public intellectuals during times of crises. And so, here I am, thinking about those issues. And then, not to get political, but in 2016, I started to really worry about how immigrants were being described in the public square. And that's when I told myself every single week, I need to get involved in the community, maybe one email, one conversation, and the universe responded with so many invitations to engage. So really my starting point was building a network. Again, Spanish professors and other faculty and staff at a neighboring Wofford College created Alianza Spartanburg, this social impact network. And I remember thinking, don't even go close to them because you're going to get sucked in and I need tenure. But I did. And it was so powerful to see community activists, nonprofit leaders, community members, faculty from different institutions come together and share resources for immigrants or to learn about each other. And through that, we started to meet other people around the state, have friends who are journalists. So one key insight that I want to share with the audience is that, we need to learn how to engage with the media. And just to give you an example, sometimes if I speak about immigration to an English audience, a TV station, that I'm gonna be more careful with the language I use because normally a lot of people may not be open to a pro-immigrant, advocacy point. If I speak to a Latino media outlet, that's the audience, right? So it's less risk taking. The more of the risk that I'm taking is that, is my Spanish good? Am I communicating well? And I wanted to just mention that I did a radio interview in Spanish for 40 minutes. Oh my God, I'm so glad no one saw me on the other end because I was just sweating. I've done a radio interview in English and it's very, very difficult. So this public writing, public speaking, whether it be on Facebook Live or podcast or in different outlets, that's the way you speak, the way you deliver your message is very different from scholarly writing. But how do you get better? By having a very robust network of nonprofit friends, of friends in journalism who can really coach you in terms of, delivering your message well. But I don't know if I missed another part of your question, Michelle, or if I got a little off track.
No, that was great. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I would just add that there's a rather unglamorous starting point for a lot of these kinds of projects, and it's grant writing. What we've been able to build out so far, which is a prototype of a bigger project that I'll talk about hopefully a little bit later. The hardest part is getting like collaborators and money in place so that you can start thinking about this stuff. So my answer is a very boring one. My starting point was getting together with a few friends and colleagues who were interested in producing a platform like this, and then grant writing.
Hannah.
Yeah. I think I have always, because I came into graduate school knowing that I wanted to do public history and was invested in that, I immediately sought out those resources in graduate school and knew that Kevin Murphy and Kat Hayes were in the midst of starting a graduate minor in Heritage Studies and Public History. So I was really excited about that. They got a Mellon grant actually, and that enabled graduate students to do work for an institution. And I ended up doing an internship for the Hohokam Heritage Center, which is on the Gila River Indian Reservation, which was a great way for me of being able to bring my public history experience and my research experience, because Gila River was actually home to one of the Japanese American concentration camps that my grandfather was actually incarcerated at. So it enabled me to visit a site that was really important to me personally. It enabled me to start thinking about that work in conversation with the community, to use my public history experience and also learn more about how to do that in a way that is responsive to American Indian and specifically Akimel Atam needs. So I think that, yeah, absolutely. With what Jason was saying, like funding is so important for that sort of stuff. And another thing that Michelle and I like participated in and received funding from was Humanities Without Walls, which created 3 weeks of programming around like what you can do with a PhD that is either at the intersection of or beyond academia. We had presentations from publishers. We had the Public Housing Museum gave us a presentation, which was fantastic, still possibly one of my favorite museums, even though it wasn't even open at that point, but they had this phenomenal exhibit where they'd done community written labels for objects donated by the community, which I just think is incredible. And then, yeah, I think also, as starting points, I'm also just going to say, I think you have to be not afraid to just dive in. I feel like it's really easy to just get super overwhelmed with not knowing everything. And a lot of us aren't, we're not web designers, we're not audio engineers, we're never going to be that. But you can learn those skills. And so when I was little, I actually went to a summer camp for like digital stuff. And I think that gave me like a willingness to just experiment with different media that even if I didn't know how to do it. So I learned some programming, and I still like for Kampu, I made an algorithm to run searches of the transcripts that we weren't able to search in that way before. And that's something that I took away from just being able and willing to go into something and dive into it and not know what the end result was going to be. But I also think that that's not something that is often rewarded by grant funding, right? Like grants don't want to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to try and create this algorithm. Who knows if it's going to work or not? They want to know exactly how you're going to use that money. And that's just not how projects often work. So I really wish that there was more out there that was just like, take this money and go experiment with it.
Absolutely. And absolutely seconding the grant writing skills, and also just learning how to narrativize data in ways that's compelling for grant writers or for your audience. And also just a big shout out to Humanities Without Walls. I feel like it's one of those programs that's a gift that keeps on giving. So appreciate all the work that Humanities Without Walls does. So we've talked a bit already about writing for public audiences and knowing how to interact with your target audience. What were some of the specific ways that you've learned how to write and communicate with your target audience that departs from or perhaps translates or builds upon your scholarly training? Hannah, since I feel like podcasting is right there, let's start with you.
And I think I kind of touched on this earlier. I think it's so important that we write to reach people, right? And I think that's something that I learned from my dad, actually, because I think back in high school, I was like, very much like, I want to be a poet. I want to like write very like flowery and beautiful words. And I still think that's beautiful and so worth doing. But my dad, being the lawyer, was like, Hannah, you need to write clearly, And so now I think every time that I hear what he's saying, I think there's something also very beautiful about just writing very clearly. And so I think that's something that I have, and that poetry can be clear too, just so we're clear, Dad. But I think that, yeah, I think writing to people, being very intentional about who you're writing to is such an important first step. And for us at Kampu, we knew that we were writing to the Japanese American audience. And that's not to say that we weren't open to reaching other audiences. It's just that we felt like it was important for the Japanese American audience to be like very centered in this project, because so few of these projects do actually center Japanese American audiences. Oftentimes I get really bored actually with some Japanese American incarceration public history work because it's centered at the person who knows nothing about it. And because of that, it's sometimes just like not very engaging for people who grew up with this history in their families. And so for us, we wanted to make sure that this was something where descendants and incarcerees could learn something from it. And that's what we heard from people who were listening to it. You know, people wrote in saying that it started conversations with their family members, that they felt like they were learning their family's history for the first time. And one way that we did that was being really intentional about language. I think terminology, Araceli was making this point really well earlier, is so important to think about. So I am very intentional about using the term incarceration camp and concentration camp when referring to Japanese American incarceration. Internment camp actually refers to a legal process of detaining enemy aliens. And Japanese Americans were, 2/3 of them were American citizens. The other third was not allowed to become American citizens. And I think it's also important that we question the term citizenship and whether that facilitates human rights in a way that we don't offer to people without it, that is extremely problematic. But I also want to, first of all, just say we prioritize using community-centered language that is approved by the community because that's who we were trying to reach. So I hope that more people will do that. And I'd love to hear from Araceli and Jason.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, for us, it's complicated because, as I've alluded to a couple of times already, we do not want to be the ultimate writers of this website. We want to provide a platform for folks to engage with public art. So we want to shift from the prototype that we've developed to, I mean, I guess some people would say user-generated content. I would say community-generated content. We want to move to being a place where we can engage with folks or encourage folks or hopefully inspire folks to interpret the murals for themselves and for their community and for each other. So this is where it gets a little complicated, because what we've done is build this sort of prototype where the next phase is to do some of that work. This phase was about working with a team on campus called HUE, which is Historic Urban Environments. I'll put the link in the chat in a little bit. But HUE at Notre Dame is out of the School of Architecture, and they have been digitizing and studying and producing information about the built environment in a few places that are like architecturally significant. So I am an experiment for them, and they are an experiment for me. So they've never done anything with a humanities scholar, so they invited me to collaborate on this in the first place. So I'm the first humanities scholar. They've never done anything on more contemporary public art. They've done stuff on like ancient Rome and Seaside, which is like one of the first planned communities in Florida. So we're really working out some of these bugs. We're figuring out how do we take this from us giving information to working with community partners to build information together. And that's really where we're going. Before we can get to that, that team had to teach me how to write code. And as a very right-brained humanities scholar, that was very difficult. So when I say I'm their guinea pig, they've tried to partner with humanities scholars before, and it's never really worked out because they have felt that the humanities scholar was not very interested on the digital side and never became kind of self-propelled in terms of building out content. So I'm trying to break that model and show them that those of us in the humanities, and I know there's people in this crowd and there's people on this panel, obviously, who can do that. So I'm sort of at a crossroads here where it goes from being a project in which we are building the platform to engaging with community partners to build information and knowledge.
Yeah. So we only have about 5 minutes before I want to turn to Q&A, and I have a really meaty question for you all. And Araceli, maybe you can start us off in answering it. But each of you have begun projects that not only align with your research interests, but that also engage the community histories and identities that you yourselves hold. Could each of you speak a little bit about the relationship between your position as an academic of color and your choice to do publicly engaged work that speaks to or serves your communities?
Yes, thank you. This is such a fabulous question because, as I mentioned, I was a French professor inside, and then I was a public professor using Spanish and English outside. Really, South Carolina Centro Latino exists to really highlight in community civic life and in all spheres of academic life, the talent of Latinos and also really their absence. You may know that only 5% of Latinas, professors, if we have 100 professors, only 5 are going to be Latinas. 3 to 1% are full professors. Hopefully I'll be a full professor in a few months. So I want to use this platform. We are so few, so rare. I have to make noise for 10. And how do I do that? By bringing other women to campus, but really, where are we overrepresented, us Latina women, in non-tenure track positions, staff, in other areas of the university? We tend to be in a bubble where we have these very strict hierarchies. So South Carolina Centro Latino, through Latinx interdisciplinary studies, is also to teach us insight about that talent that we are not tapping. And that if we want to be more inclusive, we have to be inclusive of the languages we speak, of our culture. So that's a little bit of my soapbox. But again, what I really want to do is that I'm so excited that we have a statewide mission. So we have this golden opportunity to really influence the state about what it means to use language for the retention of Latinx students, staff, and engaging community members.
Awesome. And Jason, start with you.
Sorry, sure. It's complicated. I'm Latino. I'm a professor of Latino studies. So I guess now is when I would confess a little bit of naivete about, starting to partner with folks in the community, thinking that it would be a little bit easier than it was. One thing that I found very surprising is that when you tap into in the context of our project, public art and who gets to represent the community, that argument's been going on for 50 years. So when we started meeting with like museum officials and museum professionals and grassroots activists and the artists themselves, we realized that we were tapping into some very old identity fights about community belonging, partnership. A lot of that is also around resources, about who gets paid to represent Pilsen and not. One thing that we've kind of stressed to folks that we're partnering with is that we're an educational organization. So we try to do the sort of like, we absolutely will not work with anyone who wants to commodify public art in Pilsen. Like that, if we have one rule, that's been it. And that comes partly out of an argument where like a double-decker bus tour was going to start going through Pilsen a few years ago, charging $60 a ticket, and it felt like, ethnic zoology to a lot of the residents in Pilsen. So one thing we've done is we have stressed that that we have, we're not commodifying any public art here, and we're kind of agnostic around some of those issues. However, of course, my own identity as an ethnic studies scholar informs like the questions I'm asking, who will talk to me, the art, how honest artists will be with me. All of that has to be thought about before you embark on a project. Who are you in relationship to your public history or public humanities project is a question we all have to ask ourselves, and then get called out on and keep asking, and challenge ourselves and challenge each other in hopefully productive ways.
Thank you, Jason. Hannah, I don't know if you have something brief to add before we transition to Q&A.
Yeah, I think I'll just say, I think it's important to think about where we are within our communities and also the limits and where we don't participate in our communities. I think as a mixed Japanese American and white person, I think it's really important for me in particular to think about where my mom's whiteness in particular comes out in privilege, right? And so I think thinking about privilege is really important. And also, I also do work with American Indian communities, and I am not American Indian. So I also think acknowledging where we aren't members of communities is really important. And I think that's actually informed by having met people who don't acknowledge that they are not Japanese American, that I do feel like that's important.
Okay, so we have many questions from the audience that's been coming in through the Q&A, and they're really great questions. The first question is from Elena Pincus, and it has to do with institutional challenges. What were some of the institutional challenges to establishing your projects, and how did you overcome them? How did you socialize other faculty and students to the idea of the public humanities? She talks a little bit about some challenges in her own department, and she's wondering if you've also experienced and have advice for how to approach educating other academics about what the public humanities are.
I can go. Well, this is an underground conversation that should happen, but because this is a national webinar, I'll try to be very diplomatic. You're going to be dismissed a lot as you're not doing real work, you're doing volunteer work, whatever notions those are. That's why if there's a big message that I can share with you all is double up with your community networks. I wish I could name every single person here today who is from Wofford College, like Ramon Galiñanes and Begoña Caballero and others. Your tribe will root for you. So for me, in order to influence my institution, I had to go outside, have a platform out in the community, and then that success helped us make a case for inside of the institution. So many thanks to Maria Francisco Monteso for being a partner in this. So I would also say really reach out, volunteer, serve on professional societies like the MLA. The MLA is so wonderful because they are very supportive of this type of work. So I would say that, build your allies within the institution and outside, and eventually people will see the success that you're having. Why do we have success? Because this meets a community need. We have a big enrollment issue. We need to engage our communities more authentically. So I would give that.
Others?
I can go next, I guess. I feel like I might have a bit of an atypical answer because I knew that I did, and that there was a strong possibility that I would consider going back into public history after graduate school, which I think does make me a pretty atypical PhD student. And also I did not end up doing that. I am now an assistant professor at UConn. So I think I came in immediately asking what resources there were going to be for students who wanted to do public history when I went into graduate school. And I did the same thing when I was applying for my job at UConn. My job is actually, I am an assistant professor of digital public history and Asian American studies. And so I would say, yes, there has been a lot of institutional support for my job. I think that the history department really understands the importance of digital public history and is invested in increasing that support. I have been assured that there will be support for me in the tenure process. I am a little bit nervous about what that looks like because this has not happened before, but they have actually supported faculty going up for from associate to full professor, who are using public history projects as part of their justification for that promotion. So that framework is still being worked on, but I think that I get to be a part of that process, and I'm sure that that will bring certain challenges with it. But I think just asking transparently about what resources there are available for that work before you even get started in committing to them is like probably a good place to start if you have the opportunity to do that.
I can't possibly say it better than those two. I will just underscore something that Hannah says, which is if you are an academic, talk to your chair or your divisional dean to see in writing what counts for tenure, and see if it's not already in writing, if you can get it into writing, that public humanities stuff counts. My own department rewrote our organizational plan a few years ago to make it more friendly to public-facing projects for all of these reasons. So I think the first thing you should just do is start asking questions immediately about what counts.
Awesome. So we have our next question is about building community partnerships and relationship building. I'm sort of combining a couple of questions here, but the scope of the questions is, can you speak a little bit to how you built out your community partnerships, especially in the context of perceptions of university and faculty in communities? Did you have any structural support in building those partnerships, or were you sort of forging those yourself? What did that process look like for you?
I can start with that. I think it's an ongoing process. I think it's going to be a lifelong process. And I guess kind of going back to your earlier question, Michelle, the other thing that I would say is that it's important to start out by listening to those communities, and it's also, and to continue listening, I guess. And that I think that work, it just needs to be happening all the time, right? Yeah, I don't know that I have anything else to say to that, actually. Listen.
And maybe, so once you start getting more and more involved in the community, I do have to warn you that you may become a little bit popular for more service. So I do serve on a few boards. And then the board started to feel a little bit like academia, where they don't really represent the surrounding communities. So my first op-ed was on board diversity. But by serving on boards, actually, you learn so much, how to write strategic plans, mission, vision statements. It prepares you for, I didn't know I was going to be the founding director of El Centro. It helps you also with grant writing. Other friends know how to do that well. So, once you become more involved, and people see you there, you can't just go in for one semester and then leave. It's a long relationship building process where that takes a lot of responsibility, because you're an ambassador in a way to your university, your unit. So, again, we have to be very careful that we don't project certain ideas of being elitist or of not listening to the community members.
Yeah, I would just underscore what they said again, but also mention that this question relates a lot to the skill set questions that we've gotten, so partly in the chat, partly in some notes from Michelle, which is, to me, this was a new skill set, going to the museums, going to grassroots organizations, going to arts organizations, and introducing myself, trying to get them interested in us and seeing how we could be of service to them. Yeah, the part of the question was, did your institution help you? Short answer, no. This takes self-help. And it took a lot of cold calling, a lot of door knocking, and a lot of begging for meetings and people's already very valuable time.
So we have a couple questions. One about engaging students in co-creating public humanities projects, but then we also have a really great question about what changes you would like to see advocated for on university campuses to better reward public humanities work. You've all sort of touched a little bit on the tenure and review process. And Araceli, I know that you've been a part of the MLA working group around this. Any thoughts on either involving students or advocating for this type of work on campuses writ large?
I can tackle the second one, which is we have to expand the definition of what is research. I can't remember if it was Araceli or Hana who mentioned kind of that this gets treated like volunteerism. And I think what we have to do is, like, when I say we, I mean everyone on this panel, everyone in the audience, everyone in the world has to make institutional change in terms of what counts as research. Everything you've heard described here from my co-panelists is research and needs to count toward their job description. Hana, it sounds like it sort of does count in your job description when you gave us your title, but to me, this is a real challenge, because I've seen at Notre Dame, it happens a lot. There's sort of the real research and then that fun stuff that some faculty, especially faculty of color, choose to engage in that looks cute or is sexy and is attractive in various ways, but it's not really research. I think we need to work, institutionally. To me, it starts at the department. I'm a department chair right now. And for me, it starts with rewriting that organizational plan, reinforcing in our department meetings, highlighting the awesome work that my colleagues are doing in this arena in order to reinforce and stay on message about really what is research.
Yes, I think that the key to sustaining all of this is keeping in mind also, community outcomes, but also students, and how they, we prepare them for active civic leadership. And I know that through research with Latino students that they are most influenced by civic leaders, and also because we are so few inside of the university, I need to put those civic leaders in front of them. So our students are participating with us, especially in the pillar with community interpreting, doing a lot of service learning, interpreting, ethics of interpreting, getting training on that. Helping other adults, bilingual adults, getting trained in that. But I just put in the chat this amazing short essay, Academic Generosity, referencing this book here that is more, mainstream versus academic insurgency. I love Ruiz, who's part of this MLA committee. This speaks to me. It's like my manifesto. And it talks about how we are so few of us, faculty of color in our institutions, and we have this yearning to bridge that gap between the community and our institutions. And in finding ways, despite our positions, despite the boxes sometimes that we're in, that we transform our institution. So that work has to be valued, and DEI work, even though it sounds sexy, it's not really paid. So we need more course releases, and we need to be valued.
And quickly, one last question that might be a bit of a crowdsourcing moment for folks. Jason, I know that you're a Whiting Fellow. Hana, you mentioned Humanities Without Walls. Are there any grants that you want to put on folks' radars or funding structures that have been really helpful for you or that folks should know about in this audience?
I beg the audience to look at the Whiting Foundation. Specifically, I'm a Whiting Public Engagement Fellow, and I think that says everything that they have in their title, that they want to fund humanities projects or liberal arts projects that are public facing. It's an important part of that foundation. So it is a somewhat grueling application process, but also I think generous in terms of funding. So please think about the Whiting Foundation.
Any others? State Humanities Councils are also a great resource. Hana, yeah.
I was just going to say another shout out for Humanities Without Walls. If you're a grad student and your institution is part of it, it's a great program that will give you like $5,000 in funding for the summer, and also like give you a bunch of institutional support for learning about other opportunities in the public humanities.
Awesome. Well, we've reached the end of our hour together. And I just want to thank our panelists today for generously donating their time and expertise. Thank you so, so much. Our next webinar in this Humanities for All Public Humanities winter webinar series will be on supporting faculty in creating engaged coursework. And that will be happening January 13th at 1 p.m. So I would encourage you all to look out for that. And if you have any additional questions for our panelists, I'm sure that they would love to hear from you. There were so many questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to. So I hope that you are able to connect outside of this space. But in the meantime, I hope you all enjoyed our conversation today, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.